Well, hello everyone, and a warm welcome and good afternoon to our viewers. I'm Richard Maude from Asia Society and the Asia Society Policy Institute. I'm delighted you can join us today for the launch of the China Story Yearbook 2019 China Dreams. As many of you know, the China Story Yearbook is the annual flagship publication of the Australian National University's Australia Centre on China in the World. In the words of the yearbook itself, it seeks to illuminate political and economic developments in China through scholarship that's informed by language, history, and culture. The yearbook takes its name from the idea that China's story is much more than the version portrayed officially by China's Communist Party. Now, book launches are normally lively affairs in person. They're a moment of celebration after the enormous amount of hard work that goes into producing any book. This year, of course, it's not possible to do a traditional launch, but we hope this online event will serve as a virtual celebration matched with what I'm sure will be a very interesting discussion about the yearbook and its China Dreams theme. As we go along, please feel free to submit your questions and comments through the live chat box at any time. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our panel, but before doing so, I would like to recognise that many participants in today's events will be watching from locations that have traditional owners and custodians, and I'd like to acknowledge those owners and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend those respects to any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander or other First Nation people who might be joining our webcast today. Now, here today with me to launch the China Story Yearbook 2019 are Jane Golley, Darren Lim and Louisa Lim. Jane is the director of the Australia Centre on China in the World. She is a co-editor of the yearbook. Jane's an economist with a particular focus on Chinese economic transition and development issues. Jane's also a regular contributor to the national discussion on Australia-China relations. Welcome, Jane. Louisa Lim is a senior lecturer at the Centre for Advancing Journalism at the University of Melbourne. She's a former journalist who reported from China for many years, an author and host of the excellent Little Red podcast, whose tagline is China Beyond the Beijing Beltway. A warm welcome to you, Louisa. Darren Lim, our third guest today, is a senior lecturer in the School of Politics and International Relations at the Australian National University. He's also the co-host with Alan Gingell of the equally excellent Australia in the World podcast and writes on major power rivalry, geoeconomics and technology competition, among other weighty subjects. Welcome, Darren. The last point in my introduction is to note that perhaps most important of all is that Jane, Darren and Louisa are also all contributing authors to the 29 China Story Yearbook. Now, Jane, if I can begin with you, well, first of all, this is a launch, so congratulations on the yearbook. As ever, it's full of diverse and interesting perspectives. It really does shed light on many of the big China developments in 2019. And as ever, of course, the production values are wonderful. It's a really beautiful looking publishing production. I do know you're disappointed that you can't crack a bottle of champagne over the book, but I spy one in the corner of your bookshelf there, so perhaps you're set up for a celebratory glass anyway.
Oh, thanks, Richard, and thanks everyone for joining us. I will just do a few more quick thank yous to get things going to us, the Asia Society, especially for hosting us today, to my fantastic editing team, Linda Javen, Ben Hillman and Sharon Strange, along with the creative design team, which, as Richard said, makes the book just look so beautiful every year. Of course, also a huge thanks to all the wonderful contributors to the book. It wouldn't exist without them. And to a web team that's been working around the globe and around the clock to make sure that the book is now available online at our newly revamped website, thechinastory, all one word, .org. As for the champagne, yes, I do think we should be having a relaxing time to celebrate today. I went to the liquor store to purchase a bottle of champagne, but I found myself accidentally in the gin aisle and I came across this bottle, which I hope you can get a little bit of a glimpse of. It's called Giniversity, and it was irresistible for me. So I wasn't sure which one to go with. I actually tweeted that dilemma last night, and one of my ANU colleagues and a contributor to the book, Brendan Taylor, replied by saying that in these tumultuous times, surely that I needed Wulangjiu, a famous Chinese liquor, instead. And miraculously, I went to the cupboard this morning, and the only bottle in my otherwise empty liquor cabinet turned out to be a long ago re-gifted bottle of Wulangjiu, which I thought was pretty coincidental. So anyway, I've got three options, and I don't know where everyone is sitting and listening to us today, but I thought, you might like to fill your own glasses to make this more relaxing. Please do that if you'd like to. You also might like to vote for which of those liquors I toast with at the end of it. I'm going to be drinking water for the duration into that. Guarantee this isn't gin. But if you think we do a really good job, perhaps you could give us the gin vote. If you think we're okay, champagne would do. And if you think we're awful and you really want to punish me, then please vote for Wulangjiu.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Jane. Well, let's hope we do well enough to get the best bottle. And let's hope that one day in the not too distant future, we can sit down together and clink glasses. But in the meantime, perhaps you could get us going by telling us a little more about the history of the yearbook and how you settled on the theme of China Dreams for your retrospective on 2019. And you might also show us the cover of the book and let our viewers know about the backstory of the character that's in the centre of the front cover, and also the illustration of the China Dream Girl.
Sure, Richard, I'll see how I go with that. This is the 8th book in the China Story Yearbook series, which was started by CIW's founding director, Jeremy Barmay, in 2012. And each year we basically come up with a theme that we think best reflects the events that are unfolding in China during that year. So, for example, in 2016, the book was called Control. I've just got it casually behind me on the bookshelf there. But in any case, that was the year, I think, that we really started to see President Xi Jinping exerting his control on so many aspects of China's economy, the government and the society in general. But it was also the year that China abolished the one-child policy, replacing it, of course, with the two-child one instead. So that was a good example of the government actually relinquishing control during that year too. In 2018, we chose power as the theme. We've been talking about China as a rising power for over a decade now, but I think this was the year when the tensions between the US and China really dominated the global headlines. That was most obvious with the trade war, but more generally, I guess, with the US grappling with its potential loss of status as the world's only superpower. In that book as well, there were plenty of stories of disempowerment, the suppression of the Uyghurs being, I guess, the prime example. So for 2019, we started thinking about anniversaries because there were so many coming up, and we realised pretty quickly that a lot of these reflected and connected to different sets of Chinese dreams, or in some cases, many cases, nightmares. It was 100 years since the May 4th movement in 1919, which was basically a dream of patriotism and cultural renewal. It was also 70 years since the founding of the People's Republic. That was a dream built on revolution and striving for national strength. It was 30 years since the student-led protests that culminated in the tragic events of Tiananmen in 1989, which Louisa will talk more about. They were individual dreams of democracy and greater freedom that were eventually, or pretty quickly, crushed by the government's own dreams of unity, stability, and one-party rule. I guess many of these ideas seem to be playing out in new ways in 2019, but reflecting some of those old stories. Xi Jinping continued to talk about his own China dream for national rejuvenation. I think in the international press, we saw many stories of the great advances that China was making in its technological capacities, in artificial intelligence and in space. The country also continued, I think, to demonstrate its national strength on the global stage. Lots still being written about the Belt and Road Initiative and Huawei, of course, featuring heavily in a whole range of different newspaper stories. Xi also continued his campaign to eliminate black and evil and to stamp out evil cults. And I think both of these are pretty consistent with his ambitions to make China a unified but also civilized world power. There were plenty of nightmares, and you'll see those in the book: escalating violence in Hong Kong, the ongoing surveillance of the Uyghurs, and a less well-known story that's pretty relevant today. We've got one on the unfortunate return of the pneumonic plague, which was thought to be eradicated, but somehow made its way from Inner Mongolia to Beijing in 2019, and that's a pretty foreboding sign of where we are today. So we talk about all of those topics and more in the book, which is why we call it China Dreams and not the China Dream, really stressing that Xi's own version of that dream isn't entirely consistent with the dreams of China's 1.4 billion people. So I hope you can see that beautiful cover there. The girl on the front is sitting on a cracked surface, and it'd be even more cracked if we were writing this book in 2020. She's basically a clay figure who was displayed on government billboards across the country in the early years of Xi's China Dream campaign. And she was promoting the idea or the phrase, the China Dream, my dream, which is clearly not always the case. As for the character Meng, which you can see in the red paper cutting there, I think I've taken too long already, so I'm going to refer you to Jing Jing Chen's fabulous forum on the Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi's very interesting butterfly dream, which she uses to discuss the etymology of Meng. But essentially, as a starting point, it means dream.
Okay, thanks, Jane. That's terrific, and terrific to see the front cover. And as you say, the character, there's lots about the meanings of the character and the origins of it in the book itself. I might just ask you one last question before we bring in our other participants today. But the Australia's own relationship with China, of course, has become much more difficult to manage as China has changed in recent years. We have a big public debate about the challenge of managing the relationship and how best to do it. How do you hope the yearbook will contribute to that public discussion on Australia and China?
The debate certainly is fraught, and I guess the main purpose of the yearbook series has always been to turn the wealth of academic research that's produced at the ANU and really across the world into material that can be easily read by anyone who's interested in learning about China. And so we deliberately draw on a wide range of authors, from both within and outside of China, from different backgrounds, to tell not just the government version of the China story, but the myriad of intertwined Chinese stories from different perspectives, that encompass the economy, the culture, the history, the language, the politics, and most importantly, the diversity of all of those people. I think, or I hope, what becomes clear as you read through the series, and certainly what I've learned in my 25 years of studying China, is that you never get to the end of discovering the truth about the country and all its complexities. So I guess my main hope always with the book is that it helps learn, or it helps to teach us anything that might help you understand this incredibly complex country and enliven Australia's China debates in the process.
Okay, thanks, Jane. Well, look, having had a chance to read the digital version myself, it's certainly, it has many layers to it, and I certainly learnt quite a lot from reading the essays in it and found some new insight. And I think, as you say, it's always valuable when you are able to produce a product that can do that for your readers. I want to bring Louisa and Darren into the discussion now. I want to start with Louisa. And together with ANU academic and Louisa's Little Red podcast co-host Graham Smith, Louisa's written a terrific essay in the yearbook about the parallels between Beijing's response to the protest movement of 1989 and the student-led protest we saw in Hong Kong over the course of last year. So, Louisa, perhaps you could just begin by talking a little bit about those comparisons. What conclusions did you draw? How valid is it to make comparisons between 1989 and 2019?
Oh, yes. Thanks so much, Richard. I mean, I think there's some wariness about drawing comparisons between the two movements because the context is really so very different. But we really felt that there were lots of similarities, both such major social movements, the really all of society movements. And in Hong Kong, where you were seeing as many as 2 million people marching out of a population of 7 million, that's, you know, really a sizable chunk of the population. But we were most interested in looking at the extent to which Beijing is still informed by the Tiananmen playbook, despite the passage of, 3 decades, and despite the fact that Hong Kong's own political proposition is really quite different. It has its own administration run by Carrie Lam. But we really broke it down into how we could see this playbook playing out. And the places where it was really obvious was the rhetoric, particularly the rhetoric from state-run newspapers and officials, and the kind of tactics. And when you looked at the rhetoric used towards the movement in Hong Kong, it was astonishing how closely it paralleled the kind of phrases that were used in 1989, this talk of black hands behind the movement, of hostile forces, external foreign forces, and all of these really, I think, worked to undermine the demands of the protesters by blaming trouble on external forces. There's also a lot of talk of life or death struggles, ramping up the sort of importance of what was happening. And one really interesting point was early on in the middle of June, I think it was June the 12th, when protesters surrounded the legislature in Hong Kong to try and stop the second reading of the extradition bill, which was at the center of the protests. There was this moment when Hong Kong's chief executive called the protest a riot. And to anyone who studied 1989, that was really similar to the moment that they're on the April 26th editorial in the People's Daily, when they also labeled the protests in Beijing turmoil. And in both cases, these sort of designations was so contentious that they became part of the demand to remove this designation. And the designations ended up swelling the protests. So in a way, you could see that was a place where perhaps lessons had not been learned. The one big lesson that Beijing, of course, did learn from 1989 was the cost of deploying the People's Liberation Army against its people, and particularly the international cost and the cost of imposing martial law. So we've seen in Hong Kong a very carefully calibrated response using different tactics, the emergency regulations ordinance, to sort of impose a de facto curfew, which would sort of sidestep having to impose martial law. And we have not seen, although many people worried about it, particularly people in Hong Kong, we have not seen the deployment of troops. We've seen the use of Hong Kong police, in particular riot police, to suppress protests. And to us, this was still actually surprisingly reminiscent of 1989, but not 1989 in Beijing, 1989 in Chengdu, in the province of Sichuan, where the People's Armed Police, the paramilitary police, were the way in which the movement there was suppressed, and it was suppressed quite violently. People died, but it was suppressed in a way that kind of fell below the international radar. So there were many years where nobody ever talked about that invisible suppression. And I think, in the discussion about Tiananmen in Hong Kong, what we have seen is this other type of suppression where is more similar to 1989 Chengdu than 1989 Beijing, but there still has been a sort of carefully calibrated response to suppress riots without just at the level which is just sort of low enough to get by without getting international sanctions.
Yeah, thanks, Louisa. That's very interesting, and it perhaps does help explain why we didn't see a more overt intervention that of course, many of us worried about during 2019. Your essay also says that another lesson that the party learnt after 1989, or it felt that it had to learn, was really to double down on political education or re-education. And your essay presents a pretty grim outlook for Hong Kong and the protest movement in that light. You say what we're likely to see is more violence and possibly even a Xinjiang-style political re-education campaign. So what do you think is the protest movement's future? What has COVID-19 done to the protest activity? Could we see it start up again?
Yeah, I mean, I think COVID-19 has not ended the protests. The protests are still going on. They're just sort of being driven further online, which is actually where they always were. You know, a lot of the discussion and cooperation has always been online. I think one thing that has happened is the pandemic has allowed the protesters a bit of time to sort of move back from very large street protests and mass protests and think about other ways of carrying forward the movement. So we have seen, for example, a real push to register trade unions in order to actually try and gain more votes when it comes to legislative council elections towards the end of the year. There has been some street action still, and often it's directed towards the government. It's calling, you know, early on, there was a move, for example, by medical personnel to call for borders to be closed down with China. So I think we are seeing still a great deal of public anger that's below the surface. And although in Hong Kong, I think there's been quite a successful attempt to manage the COVID curve. I think a lot of people in Hong Kong would argue that did not come from the government, but that came from civil society. And in a way, civil society is being strengthened by that, almost sort of operating without the government. For its part, I think we are seeing these moves to use the coronavirus to clamp down on protest action. So I think recently there was an attempt to make gatherings of more than 4 people illegal because of coronavirus. But also this effectively outlaws any kind of protest gathering or assembly. And so those are sort of areas to look out for in future, I think, where the government is able to use the sort of social distancing and coronavirus measures in a way which could also impinge upon civil liberties in Hong Kong.
Thanks, Louisa. I've got 2 more questions for you. I think one last one on Hong Kong, and then I want to ask you about another issue that you've written about recently, which is COVID-19 and global narratives. But the question on Hong Kong is just about the future of Hong Kong. Obviously, last year was enormously damaging to the Hong Kong economy, to society, to Hong Kong's reputation. And there's a separate essay in the Yearbook, a second one about Hong Kong by Anthony Dapiran, and he concludes that 2019 might be remembered as the last year of Hong Kong as it was. Is Anthony right? Do you think we've seen the end of Hong Kong as it was?
I mean, I think a lot of things that Hong Kong people celebrate Hong Kong for, those sense of Hong Kong values, are very much under threat. You know, the neutrality of the civil service, an independent judiciary, all these kind of things have come under threat in the last year. And then I think there's also been a sort of psychological toll on people because of the complete breakdown of trust in the government, a feeling that there's no sense of security as provided by the government because of the behavior of the police and the number of arrests. I mean, we've seen more than 7,000 arrests. So in many ways, the very things that Hong Kong is celebrated for are under threat. I think at the same time, there are many in Hong Kong who would argue that the last year has seen the emergence of a different kind of Hong Kong, and one which is perhaps working together, you know, civil society, which is working together. So it is the end, perhaps, of one kind of Hong Kong, and perhaps could lead to the emergence of a different kind.
Well, clearly this is a story that we are going to keep following. Just quickly, I just wanted to turn to a different subject. You've written separately on China's efforts to control the global narrative about the source of COVID-19 and its handling of the outbreak. Anyone who follows international affairs would have to be aware of this. It's a very big story. It's a very aggressive campaign by China, and you've described it as Beijing's first truly international propaganda offensive. So what tactics are China using, and what does this tell us about how China now seeks to control global stories about itself?
Yeah, I think we're really seeing China's sort of propaganda tactics going global. We've been used to China being able to rewrite its own history for its own audience, but this is the first time that it's rewriting the present in real time, and we can see that happening for a global audience. And the tools are interesting. We can tell it's for a global audience because there's this massive social media disinformation campaign going on through Twitter. And it's also using Chinese diplomats in quite a different way to amplify these messages. So we saw the foreign ministry spokesman bringing up this conspiracy theory that the coronavirus might have somehow been brought to China by US military. And then this conspiracy theory being amplified all over Twitter by Chinese diplomats and then reported widely in the press, but also because we've seen acquisitions by China and Chinese sort of businesses with Chinese interests buying newspapers worldwide. I think this gives more platforms for these kind of theories to be passed around. So I think what we are seeing is quite an aggressive campaign that is global and that is being backed up with all this COVID diplomacy with face masks and respirators being sent to other countries. And I think it just represents a new stage in China's attempts to shape the narrative about China, and in particular, the global narrative about China. And in some respects, I think it's been quite effective, quite successful.
All right, thanks, Louisa. Well, I want to bring Darren in now, and I'm going to ask Darren to comment on your last point there, which is how successful it's been. Darren, I'm sure you're following this issue. How successful do you think it's been around the world? And I'm happy for you to disaggregate the world. So think about what impact it's having on Asia compared to what impact it's having on major power relations and on the West more broadly.
Thanks, Richard. My headline answer isn't especially satisfying because I think it's really too soon to say. My sense is that among Western media, and I'll include Western elites in that, it's not being successful because of numerous missteps in China's mask diplomacy. Think of faulty equipment that's been provided. Think of the insistence from the Chinese side that recipients provide effusive praise for the delivery of assistance. And it's also not succeeding because of some of the really excellent media reporting that is continually bringing to light how slow Chinese authorities were in the early stages of the outbreak and ignoring early warnings. Just yesterday, think of the bombshell report from the Associated Press that there was this very important 6-day window in the middle of January between which there were serious warnings given to Chinese leadership about the possibility of an outbreak. And on the 20th, when Chairman Xi Jinping gave a public warning and began the process of lockdown. So I think that the media narrative is certainly pushing back against some of the Chinese propaganda efforts. But the question is this filtering through to ordinary publics around the world, in Asia in particular? And I don't think it probably is, simply because like us and like everyone who's watching this right now, we're living in such an extraordinary time that we've got our own problems to worry about. We're adjusting to this new life. We're adjusting to the massive economic disruption that's occurring. And so I'm not sure that people, mass publics around the world are really too, concerned about this global battle of narratives that's going on. There is an exception, I think, though, and that, of course, is in the United States, where President Trump and the White House have really looked to blame China quite centrally. And as Louisa has described, from the Chinese side, you've got an intense propaganda effort to shift some of the blame towards the United States in clear efforts at disinformation. And so I think in terms of US-China relations, it is making things significantly worse. And this, I think, is only going to get even worse given that I think that Trump is going to use China and attacks on China as being a central plank of his election campaign. And so I would expect that US-China relations will deteriorate further. But in other parts of the world, I've been looking a little bit at Europe and in Spain and Italy in particular, and my sense of looking at the media there is that folks are mostly focused on their own internal matters. In Europe, it's about corona bonds and financial recovery rather than big picture propaganda battles between major powers.
Well, it's going to be fascinating to perhaps come back to this question in 12 months' time, but it's something that we're going to follow in the meantime. So but let's come right back to the yearbook, Darren. You have an essay in the yearbook and you focus on US-China decoupling, particularly technological decoupling, which is a term that's a story in itself. And you introduced the idea of a technology security dilemma that's emerged between the United States and China. What do you mean by that term, and is there a way out of this dilemma?
Yes. So normally when international relations academics like myself talk about a security dilemma, we mean a situation where an otherwise peaceful country looks to increase its own military capabilities for the purposes of self-defense. But another country watching what the first country is doing and not sure of that first country's intentions, whether they really are defensive, feels threatened and feels the need to increase and bolster its own military capabilities in response. This then creates a spiral where each side, not sure what the other is thinking and what the other is intending, constantly feels the need to rearm itself, and that can escalate obviously into crisis and war. So in our chapter for the yearbook, we use this same frame to think about technology competition between the United States and China. Here you've got both superpowers taking actions in the technology domain because they feel their national security is under threat. For example, you've got Beijing using industrial policies to support national champions like Huawei, or in Washington, you've got the placement of export controls on key technology components, as well as looking to ban Huawei from their telecommunications networks. Now, these actions are explicitly characterized by the respective governments as being about national security, as being about securing the safety and security of their nations. Yet, as with the classic military security dilemma, these actions make the other side feel more insecure, and therefore they trigger a response and a doubling down of the same policies. And that, of course, creates this spiral of escalating feelings of insecurity, escalating responses, and then potentially, much bigger conflicts. Towards the end of our essay, then, we grapple with the question of how do you get out of this? What's the solution to a security dilemma? And in the typical international relations literature, the focus is on this concept of reassurance. What can one side do to make the other side feel less insecure? And how can that be reciprocated? In the military domain, one example is, of course, an arms control treaty where you agree to limit arms stockpiles and you have mechanisms to monitor and enforce that agreement. So our chapter posits puts a few ideas out there in that domain. What can you do to make the other side feel less insecure? And the real, the basis of it is simply that both sides need to recognize that there is an insecurity being felt, that it is genuine, and that policy responses need to take that into consideration. So a couple of examples, we suggest that Chinese companies could potentially list on US stock exchanges. That would increase the degree of transparency of their operations. On the US side, we talk about commitments to some kind of mechanism that would limit the ability of the US government to place export controls, maybe some kind of global agreement. Now, we don't suggest these things are likely. Our point more is to recognize that each would be tailored towards the specific goal of reducing the insecurity being felt by the other side.
Okay, thanks, Darren. And the discussion in the essay of those options is really interesting, but I sense from your essay that you're not entirely confident that either side is going to take some of those steps that might be logical and sensible. And certainly right now, the relationship between these two great powers is perhaps as bad as it's been for as long as I can remember. So Do you think that at least some of what you call selective decoupling is inevitable? And what does that mean for Australia if it is? Where would we go?
Yeah, it's already happening. I mean, we point out that decoupling in the internet is already well on its way with the Great Firewall, in China, but also efforts to shut out Chinese actors from telecommunications networks in the West. So, and the current crisis is only accelerating these calls. It's further, I think, bolstering a bipartisan view on both sides of US politics that China is not just a strategic competitor, but it's an adversary, and therefore it's increasing this notion of threat. And so, what can a country like Australia do? I mean, there isn't a lot in the short term, I think, that we can do. I mean, we obviously have succeeded as an economy and as a country based upon open trade and and the free movement of goods and people and ideas across borders. And so in the longer term, we're going to be hurt as both sides look inwards and withdraw away from the other to the extent that they do. I mean, in terms of principles that we can look to to advocate for, especially in a sort of a post-COVID-19 landscape. I mean, I would say, one, to the extent that countries do feel insecure, they should focus more on stockpiles of holding necessary equipment rather than, onshoring all manufacturing to their own shores, because that would allow the flow of trade to continue. Second, where there is solid political will to decouple and move sources of supply outside of China, you would look to still include as many countries as possible in supply chains, to try to keep global trade flowing. And I imagine there'd be many competitor economies who have similar economic structures to China who would be helpful in facilitating that process. But third, and we can't forget this, above all, remember that there are national security risks in decoupling itself. You might remove one set of national security challenges or threats in the act of decoupling, but you're going to exacerbate or create a new set. And I'm not just talking about the costs of decoupling in terms of higher prices. I'm talking about the dangers of looking inward and refusing to engage with the other side. And I know there's a strong debate out there that engagement with China failed as a strategy, and there is some merit to that critique, but the opposite strategy, a strategy of hostility, has very scary risks attached to it itself. So I think we in Australia need to remember that and have that shape our response.
Thanks, Darren. It's undeniably, I think, going to be one of the biggest policy preoccupations for an Australian government if we get out from underneath COVID-19, because, as you say, in some ways we ourselves have already begun a partial decoupling, certainly in parts of our telecommunications networks like 5G, and the government is thinking about what other technologies are sensitive and critical. So a really important subject and a great contribution in the yearbook for you and your essay. Jane, you've been sitting quietly and patiently, so I'd like to come back to you and ask you about the essay that you have authored in the yearbook. And you have written about some of the challenges for Australian universities in managing engagement with a more authoritarian and ideological China. And I wonder if you could tell us what you see as the Chinese government's biggest threats to academic life on Australian campuses.
Sure, and thanks to my two co-authors, James Lawrenson, Director at ACRI at UTS, and also Paul Harris, who's our ANU liaison officer sitting in DC, and they both contributed a lot to the chapter. I think the number one threat that we hear referred to so often in the press is that the Chinese government could turn off the tap if they wanted to bring the Australian university sector to its knees, because they could somehow stop the flows of students onto our campuses. And of course, that would be hugely damaging given how dependent we are on them. But this should really be a question, I think, and not a statement of fact. Can they really turn off the tap? And we've been looking into that question. There are currently 165,000 Chinese students in our higher ed sector. And for many of them, it's a lifelong dream to come and study here. They tend to find their way here through these overseas education agencies that are scattered across China. There are literally hundreds of them, most of them privately owned and not connected to the Beijing government at all. So even if the government wanted to stop them, it's not obvious that they could do it directly. They do have an indirect channel, and that's through the media. And we've seen them use that to, for example, post headline stories about Australia being unfriendly or dangerous. But it's not a great way to choke off a huge supply. And also got to wonder why the Chinese government would do that, because we're still offering this fantastic education experience, which they want. So starts off as what's perceived as a threat, but when you look more closely at the facts, I think that one kind of falls apart a little bit. On the other hand, I think the party does pose a more serious threat to academic freedom. And unfortunately, I've had direct experience with that in recent years, along with just about every other researcher engaged with China that I know of. And I'll just give you one example. A Chinese colleague of mine, she's a permanent resident here in Australia, works at an Australian university. I asked her to co-author my yearbook chapter last year. It was on girl power. And I was pretty critical of the Chinese government's gender policies, which isn't hard to do. But basically, when I asked her to write with me, she said that she couldn't because she still had family in China. And that was really upsetting for me to hear, and worrying as well, because if we don't have academic freedom, I think our universities are pretty worthless. But I do like to look on the bright side of these things, and I do again see that that's been a real opportunity actually for us to strengthen our integrity and find ways to support the academic freedoms of all of the students and all of the academics in universities across the country. And I think ANU's a great example of that. I think we're working hard towards, strengthening the institutions and the way that we look after all of the people on campus. And I've tempted to trust that the rest of the universities in the country are doing the same thing.
All right, thanks, Jane. This discussion and debate's been had in many other parts of the world, of course, including in the United States. And do you see Australia as needing or wanting distinct positions from those that might be taken in other countries?
Well, given what Darren's been talking about, I think we'll make the comparison with the US. I mean, he's describing a classic prisoner's dilemma, really, where the theoretical answer is that cooperation on these issues is going to deliver better outcomes. So that, for example, the United States in the past had education and engagement strategies towards China that were really open and welcoming, thinking that if lots of Chinese students and researchers came in, they'd teach them their values and they'd also be able to share that brain power together. This has clearly changed for the US and for China in recent years. And the US, one way of describing what's playing out in that technology battle is that on university campuses they're basically thinking that by restricting the number of Chinese students and the researchers that are entering their tertiary institutions, they can compete with China. And presumably they think they're going to win the top position. Now, I actually don't think they are going to win that competition. That's a big question that we won't have time to go into. And I really worry that Australia is going to back the losing horse in the US, with all respect to their wonderful academic institutions. But more critically, I think Australia's higher ed policies have to be different from the United States, because we are a small fish in a very big pond. The US, theoretically at least, as a large player, has some chance of defeating China and maintaining technological primacy. Whereas if we shut China out of the university sector, we are absolutely decimated in a revenue sense. But I think we're also hugely restricted or restricting our own R&D advances as well. And James Lawrenson's paper from ACRI that looks at just how important Chinese collaborations are, now the most important for all Australian or in general, ahead of the United States, I think makes that point really clearly. Now, I'm not saying, and it's easy to, I could end it there and be all very pro-China. This isn't a pro-anti-China debate. There are definitely new risks that didn't exist even, say, 5 years ago about collaborating with Chinese researchers in security-sensitive sectors. I'm certainly not suggesting that we should encourage or promote or support research that, for example, will subsequently be used for surveillance in Xinjiang. But I also think in that case, the Australian universities have done really well at satisfying government requirements that might need some tightening around the edges, but basically at being sensible and careful about the research collaborations that we pursue. One really great policy that could come out of all of this, and I think particularly in the COVID-19 context, is that the Australian government funded the university sector much better than it has in the past. That's what led us to our heavy reliance on China, both students and research funding as well. And I think, fortunately, again, one more silver lining in the cloud, we've seen some of that in the Australian government's response to the university sector for COVID-19. Many universities are in a really tough spot. I think they need more from the government, but it's a good sign, and maybe that will shift the balance in the future and we'll be able to carve a little bit more of an independent path.
Okay, thanks very much, Jane. Well, we're pretty much bang on time. So I've got one last question for you and then we'll wrap up, and that is about this year. Now, we're only in April. So much has happened already that last year itself, to borrow from your theme, seems like something of a dream, a different time, perhaps even a different era. Now, having just launched the 29 yearbook, you probably don't even want to think about the 2020 yearbook, but what do you think? Do you have any thoughts about your theme for 2020 at this early stage?
We often try to put the last book to bed before we start thinking about the next one, but it is a bit of a year-long process, and we're always basically thinking what the next one will be. It is only April, but I can't see how the 2020 yearbook won't be titled Crisis, unfortunately.
It's certainly been a hell of a year so far. All right. Well, now just finally, Jane, you were going to set a little competition, or you had set a little competition for us. And we didn't have a lot of votes, I think, but gin apparently came in as the preferred drink, certainly amongst your panelists. I don't know what that says about this panel.
I'll just show it again as I pop that open. But I also had a little competition, if I can pop it open. I'll pretend that I didn't open it last night to make sure that it tasted okay. And I'm going to have to use my champagne glass because I haven't finished all of the water in my gin glass. But I would like to propose a toast to the Asia Society, to Darren and Louisa for joining me today, and also to all of the participants who have hopefully enjoyed some of the things we had to say. I know I can't pass this down the computer, but I would if I could. Before I drink that, I also just wanted to finish with a little competition. We have launched the new website, thechinastory.org, hoping that you'll enjoy reading this and all of the last 7 yearbooks that are all now available on there. If people are more old-fashioned like me and really like a hard copy of the book, and it's got all the pictures are available online as well, but it's a beautiful book to take to the beach or read in bed. I'm going to send out 10 free copies to the first 10 people who can name the 3 Tibetan pop songs that are listed somewhere in this book. And you're also then going to have to hunt down my email, and it's not very hard to do with a name like Jane Golley. There's not too many of us in the world. Send me an email with those 3 pop songs and your address after I've confirmed that you're one of the winners, and I'll send you a hard copy book as well. Thanks, Richard. Okay,
Jane. Well, there's, for those of you who have stuck with us and still viewing, there's a little competition for you if you'd like to get hold your hands on the beautiful hard copy of this book. Find the answer to the question about the Tibetan folk songs and email Jane. A clue, look it on the ANU website and you will find her. Can I add my own thanks, Jane? It's great for Asia Society to have been part of the launch of the yearbook. I really want to thank you for your help, and also Darren and Louisa for being part of a terrific conversation. And I want to thank our viewers and hope you enjoyed this session. Please do have a look at the book, whether it's online or in hard copy. So we're going to close here, and my colleague who's helping me with the technical side will end the live streaming. But thank you very much, and good afternoon to you all.
See you.